Good day and welcome back to another episode of what I have inexplicably called Talky Time, because I am an immensely serious person, as you can obviously tell. So, this series, for those who don't know, is basically an unscripted, unprepared discussion about a concept, field, something like that. And today, we'll be looking at it's sort of the first video in a short series about animal welfare stuff, which I'm using a very broad term. The reason you don't want to say animal rights is because animal rights is actually a specific subset, which is different to welfare, different to liberation, etc. The next video will be about animal rights. Today, we're not looking at rights, we're looking at utilitarianism, which is a different form of ethics that we can look at animals with. And the reason I would start with utilitarianism, because people generally would start with deontological ethics, which is rights-based ethics, essentially. We're not, because the animal liberation sort of movement was really sparked in many ways, or not necessarily sparked, but invigorated by the works of Peter Singer, who we'll be looking at a lot today. However, we're not just going to be looking at Peter Singer. Before we get into Peter Singer, you actually want to look a little bit more at utilitarianism itself and explain what it is. So this will also be about just understanding ethics in general, this little series. So, there are two main people we'll look at sort of in general. I'm not going to look at them in depth because, no, I don't want to. It doesn't really matter. What we care about is the actual just type of ethics. So, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and then later Peter Singer, which is specifically related to animals, although not necessarily, only because both Mill and Bentham were a bit better than other people with regards to how to, respond to the problem of animal suffering and animal pleasure. So let's just first talk about what is utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is pretty much that form of ethics that I suppose you could sum up by saying the phrase, for the greater good, essentially. The idea of it is that you want to do one of two things, which we'll be talking about, but you want to either maximize pleasure or minimize suffering, which are broadly labeled as positive and negative utilitarianism. They're both obviously essentially considered a good thing, so in the sense we mean the term negative and positive in the more academic sense of the terms, to mean a yes and a no, kind of. It doesn't mean, negative utilitarianism doesn't mean being mean to animals. That's not what it means. So, what you essentially want to do here when it comes to utilitarianism, when you're thinking from a utilitarian perspective, you're going to go, all right, how do I maximize pleasure or happiness or whatever you want to call it? That would be called more so positive utilitarianism. Or how do I minimize suffering as much as possible? That would be more so negative utilitarianism. Now, Bentham, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, because it has been a while actually since I've read Bentham, but that's more so in your positive kind of utilitarianism sense, and then Mill more so in a negative utilitarian sense, and then Singer definitely in a negative utilitarian sense. Now, the thing here with both of these, it would be probably the most famous example of the utilitarian, sort of a thought experiment in the utilitarian method in their theory would be the trolley problem, which a lot of people know, especially because it has become a meme with the trolley problem replacing various things. But as a very brief explainer, if you don't know what the trolley problem is, most people do. Trolley problem is this: there is a train, or I think in the original it's a tram, whatever tram trolley thing. It is going in a direction and it's going to run over, say, 3 people. However, there is a lever, and if you pull the lever, it will change courses and only run over 1 person. You have to make one of those 2 decisions. Now, either, you might think, okay, well, if I pull the lever, I'm making an active decision to kill 1 person over 3, which is worse. However, you could also say, no, but inaction is action. If I do not pull the lever, I am still choosing to let 3 people die. So, which one would be the greater good? Now, you might say something like, okay, if it's, strangers on both sides, you might pull it to kill only one stranger. But let's say if it's 3 strangers versus the love of your life, you probably say, okay, I'm going to do one versus the other. As a matter of fact, probably one of the most famous examples of this in like popular culture is literally in the first Spider-Man movie, the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, in which the Green Goblin literally holds like a train, or no, was it a bus? I can't remember. Something full of people, and also Mary Jane, so the person that he loves, and says you have to choose one. That is a utilitarian approach. Do I let all these people die, or do I save the person I love? Now, there's kind of a cop-out in that particular sense, because it saves both, but I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, does first go for the strangers. That would probably be what most utilitarians would agree with. You should save the higher number of people, because then you are maximizing the pleasure, right? Saving as many people as possible. Or, of course, you look at the inverse and you'd say you are then minimizing the suffering by letting one person die versus multiple people die. So it's quite simple, right? That's utilitarianism. You could see some other things as something I see as a utilitarian thing, because many people do not broadly agree with utilitarianism. I don't. But utilitarianism makes sense when you're looking at scale, right? You're looking at something like government. You're looking at something like voting. Or if you are literally a politician and you have to make decisions with regards to decisions about people, what will happen to people. So you need to make the decision that will hurt the fewest number of people and benefit the highest number of people. That is why when, say, right-wing politicians do something like tax cuts for the rich, that is a bad thing. That is, you are benefiting a few to harm the majority. So that would be, like, a utilitarian would be appalled by that idea. But you can understand how utilitarianism is a very simple idea in terms of people in large groups. So politics and voting is another one. How often is it really the case where you can vote for a party you actually care about? Like, that doesn't really happen. In most countries, you have 2 to 3 parties. And the thing is, even when you get places like America, which are essentially 2-party duopolies, those countries, you might say, oh, well, there should be a third party. It's a big thing that a lot of people say in the States, being like, oh, there should be a third party. No, there shouldn't. A third party is not enough. There should not be 3 parties. There should be multiple parties, and none of them should really, although there probably shouldn't be parties, but that's a whole other conversation. But ultimately, you sit there going, cool, I have 2 to 3 choices. Which one is the least bad? In, like, the United States, you'll pretty much be like, okay, cool, either I'm a conservative, so therefore I vote Republican, or I'm a liberal, and so I vote for the Democrats, and if I'm a progressive, I don't have a party, but one of those is clearly worse than the other, so I should probably vote for the Democrats because the Republicans are awful. And similar kind of thing in America, in America, and some kind of thing in Britain, where you essentially have 2 parties, the Tories, the Conservative Party, versus the Labour Party. But they're both kind of terrible. They're both, the one's conservative and the other one's like liberal, but neither of them are like progressive, so you don't really get a choice there. Also, of course, you could look, because obviously I'm coming from the biased perspective of being a progressive, but let's say you're like a far-right person, you might also be unhappy with the political situation and go, well, there isn't a massive racist in office anymore, so there's not a politician I like. So that could also be, that's also, in that sense, no one is happy, pretty much, with politics. And that could be seen as a utilitarian perspective, to be like, well, no one actually gets what they want, but you just get the least bad option, hopefully, Now this is where you come into this idea of hedonic calculus, of turning people into maths, which is not a nice thing. Typically, people don't usually like this idea that when you actually look into utilitarianism, you're like, oh, I'm actually sitting here and going, some people are worth more than others on like a numerical scale, that I'm deciding that 3 people is more important than 1 people, which that is not necessarily the case. Are not all people worthy of saving? And so it's turning people into not people. It's turning people into inanimate objects that are, we just sort of move them around according to this calculus that we're doing. So it sounds horrible and very sort of cold, but its citizens are very, very logical. That's actually the idea here. It's very rational. It's logical. The idea is it must be separated. It must be detached, right? These are the kind of ideas. It needs to be. You can't be emotional about this. You can't be affective. So it's anti-affective. It's anti-emotion. It's like, okay, no. There's it needs to be rational. We're rational people. We believe in Socrates and the reason people. You can't have emotions in terms of human people's lives. So you can understand why some people might not really like this particular ethical theory, because it's very cold. It sort of misses any kind of emotion. It's saying, oh no, people are worth, like say, probably a very, very important statement was actually made by Jeremy Bentham, which is essentially, because I'm paraphrasing now, where everyone counts for one and not more than one. So cool, that's great. Everybody counts as one, so there's no like emotionality there. But some of us might ascribe value to a human individual. You might say some people are worth more than others. A serial killer might be considered to be worth less to you than the world's leading cancer or AIDS researcher. So do our lives actually equal to each other? So should it actually be that particular case? Or is it contextual? That doesn't really take into account context, which is what we'll kind of do in sort of more so the third of these videos. Because I'm doing these more so in the order that people, that the big ones sort of did. And we're only doing 3. So this is where we then cross over into non-human animals. Now, before we do this, if you're not familiar with the things that we do to animals and why we need to have ethics with regards to animals, then I would recommend watching the video that was literally before this one, which was titled What We Do to Animals. It is quite explicit, it's quite long. It is depressing. I will not lie. It is all of those things. It is not nice. The things we do to animals are awful and comprehensive. That's the other thing. It's not great. We're not cool people. Anyway, so non-human animals. We're going to already start from the perspective that you agree. By intrinsically watching this video, you do agree, or you want to see a perspective on someone who agrees, that animals deserve to be taken into consideration from an ethical perspective. Now, utilitarianism actually basically already had a bias towards animals, not against animals. That the next theory will have a bias against animals. But they actually had one for animals. There is a quote that comes from Jeremy Bentham. Once again, I'm paraphrasing the exact quote, but the exacts don't really matter. But he says, with regards to animals, the question is not whether they can feel pleasure. The question is, can they suffer? So it doesn't actually matter whether or not. So let's just say we'll be like, okay, cool. Non-human animals, they're not capable of the same things human animals are. Which is still a big thing up for debate. It's usually more so in degree rather than in category. But you could be like, okay, well, animals don't have a society and whatever, blah, 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 blah. All the usual things that you might have heard about people, trying to lessen the position of animals. So, cool. I'd say that. But can we not agree that non-human animals are capable of feeling suffering? They are capable of pain. They are capable of fear, anguish. Many animals mourn their dead. They are capable of experiencing suffering. Now, suffering is already inherent in the world. Everyone and everything suffers. However, we choose as a society to perpetuate more suffering on non-human animals for our own convenience and for what we want. So Peter Singer, so we come to Peter Singer. Peter Singer basically extended the utilitarian perspective to animals specifically. Now, people like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill were essentially, you would consider them for their time, quite ahead of their time in terms of non-human animal welfare. But Peter Singer is the one who specifically tied these two things together and said, listen, let's look at a couple of things. Let's look at factory farms. All right, now, if you don't know what factory farms are, I'm not going to go into it. I expect you to already know what factory farms are. If you don't, as I said, watch that video. / listen to that video. It has no visuals. You can just listen to it. So you might say, okay, cool. Factory farms. Factory farms are where we get our meat in factory quantities. So, is our food that really, be honest, here's the thing that I will always just say, because I've met so many people over the years who've said this nonsense thing. They'll go like this. No, we have to eat animals, because there's special protein in animal meat. There's special protein that you don't get the special animal protein, and that's nonsense. There's no such things like special animal, but you can get protein anywhere. There's a reason vegans don't just die. They live just as long, usually longer, and are healthier than meat eaters. So that's an absolute nonsense fabrication. And then you also get things like, oh no, but it's the natural order. God put us in charge of the... God doesn't exist. If you believe in God, that's fine, but justification of something like the story of the Garden of Eden, where man was given dominion over the animals, sure, if you want to be like, yes, well, that's what God says. Okay, well, if you agree with that, you should agree with what's in the exact same chapter in Genesis, is that women are also inferior to men. So if you're going to believe one, you got to believe the other. You can't pick and choose what parts of the Bible you want to agree with. You have to either be like, yes, sometimes murder and rape is justified, if you believe in the Bible. So, take the whole book, don't do patchwork, don't be a coward, believe in the book or don't believe in the book, do one or the other. So, in terms of factory farms, you can then say, so we've now got that nonsense idea out of the way that humans are in some way special. Is the amount of suffering animals experience, the amount of suffering that animals experience in factory farms, is that amount of suffering lower than the pleasure we receive? Now, you could say, if the amount of suffering an animal experiences is low, and the amount of pleasure that a human experiences because of the food, then you could say, yes, that's fine. But could you really say that? People who don't know anything about factory farms think it's just basically death, like I say, a quick death. Sure, a lot of the time it is a quick death, not always, but it's more so about the lives of the animals. They are kept in a state of perpetual torture for months or years before they are finally killed. So would you say all of that cumulative months or years of misery, is really worth that stake? Is it really worth it? Is your pleasure so much more important than their suffering? So you could look at this from a utilitarian perspective. Obviously, pleasure and suffering. Are you more important than they are? Is your convenience, your taste, is that more important than their suffering? Or do you just like meat? Because that's actually that's the only real argument for eating meat. I like the taste. Do not say, oh, it's the natural order, there's special no, there isn't. You just like the taste of meat, and you don't want to eat vegetarian or vegan food because you're a coward. That is why. You like the taste. Don't pretend otherwise. So, there we go. Factory farms. Now, Peter Singer said all about experimentation. Now, you could, from a utilitarian perspective, sometimes justify experimentation. If I have to kill, basically torture and experiment on, say, 100 mice, but out of that 100 mice, I can now develop a new form of chemotherapy that will potentially save hundreds of thousands of people. You could say, okay, yeah, the calculus there, right? If we're saying that a human life and a rat's life are worth the same, right? According to Bentham, right? 1 life is equal to 1. No more, then you could say, yes, okay, in the terms of the hedonic calculus, yes, they do experience the suffering, however, it is ultimately for good. So you could justify some experimentation with non-human animals. However, a lot of experimentation you can't, especially say something like cosmetics. Can you really sit there and be like, no, that sure, chemo, saving people's lives. Sure. But I want to test shampoo. So I'm going to torture animals by pouring it on them. I'm being very, very vague. If you want to know the specifics, look at that video that I said before. If we want to try and justify it, you can't. You can't say, oh, well, I want to have, smoother hair. I want to have silkier, smooth, tresemme hair. And you could just say, well, no, that's not the same as like saving people's lives. So no, your pleasure out of that bottle of shampoo is not the same as the suffering that creature experienced. So no, that's nonsense. But you could always go from extremes. Let's say this, right? I had to kill 1,000 rabbits. I had to kill 1,000 rabbits to make this shampoo. However, this shampoo is going to be on the market for 50 years. So could you then say the amount of pleasure cumulatively that humans experience because of it outweighs the initial suffering? That's an immediate issue. That's a problem with utilitarianism. Because if you just go on a large enough scale, you can kind of justify anything. If I were to say something like, okay, well, I could, like say I need to save, I need to save the human race. So I need to, let's just say you're like a population control person. So you kill 5 billion people. You go, wow, that's a lot. But then, 10 million years later, far more people have lived than those who died. So could you argue that those deaths were worth it? Now that's a problem in utilitarianism. A lot of ethics people, like utilitarians, will see this problem. They go, yeah, I don't know, that seems like a bit of a problem in my ethical view, that you can justify mass murder and genocide because it helps others. Also, you could always argue certain things like that. You could argue really bad things from a utilitarian perspective. For instance, you could, if you were, for instance, a person in Germany in the 30s, and you had a certain belief that a certain group of people was inferior, and so we needed to kill them all, you could believe that you're doing the good thing. That's why you would have heard that expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You could say that the Nazis had, in their view, good intentions. Everyone else will look at them and go, those were not good intentions, but they will sit there and go, no, but this is what we believe in. To us, this is good. We were doing good by what we did. Whereas the rest of the world just goes, no. So what somebody sees as good or bad is relative based on your particular position in society. To a extremely rich person, let's say, this is a perfect example. Let's look at a really rich person who's like, well, I want to make a little bit more money, so I'm going to lay off half my workforce. Thousands of people out of work. To me, this was good. To them, that's bad, but I'm not them, so who cares? The business is more important than these individual people's lives. Obviously, I need to buy a new yacht. I don't like my other 3 anymore. The one is too small. The other one veers slightly to the left. They say it doesn't, but it does. See, you can determine your own belief on what is good or bad based on your position, your culture, your viewpoint, your sex, your gender, your race. You can determine what is good based on who you are. So it doesn't really work in that sense, because you could say, oh no, it's fine if these people die, but those people probably don't want to die. It's everybody kind of does want to live, generally. Obviously there are some exceptions, but people generally want to live. And so, that's a problem. When my interests clash with yours, whose are more important? Whose greater good is more important than the other person's greater good? Whose? Is it mine or yours? And this is why, broadly, Peter Singer is like, listen, we need to embrace something like vegetarianism. Now, this is also old. It was published in 1975, so probably by today's standards you would say veganism, rather, which has now been compounded by other factors like environmental damage. Global warming is probably one of the biggest reasons now that you should embrace veganism as a personal choice. But essentially, it's like, listen, your convenience, your enjoyment of meat is not worth what these animals have to go through to get it. Now, there are a lot of things he doesn't discuss. He essentially discusses factory farms, experimentation, vegetarianism, and speciesism. And also, just as a quick thing, speciesism, that basically think of that as discrimination based on animals. At some point in time, I think I might do like a proper video about it. It could be quite an interesting like term to explore and explain what people really mean by speciesism. But he basically comes out and says, listen, we've been applying this utilitarian approach to humans for so long. What about non-human animals? Are not they alive? Do they not count? Or don't they matter? Are you saying non-human animals don't matter because they're not humans? And that's essentially what he's pointing out then. He's saying, like, listen, we need to actually look at these things. This is important. This is really important. These creatures are suffering because of our actions, because of our convenience. We've been hurting non-human animals for as long as human beings have been around. We've been using them for our interests because there's a long-standing view that, especially, say for instance, if you were raised Christian, that we have dominion over nature. We can do whatever the hell we want to it because it is ultimately in service to us. The environment, we can exploit it. We can kill animals because we want their fur, because we want their meat, because we want whatever. But is that the correct perspective, or is that very much, not the correct perspective? And he's essentially just pointing the speciesist problem out, saying, listen, you're discriminating against non-human animals by claiming that they are less important than humans. And you will often see this as well with people who get angry about like animal rights people, animal welfare people. You'll get people who be like, oh, why do you care about animals when there's so much human suffering going on? Which is then inherently you saying human suffering is more important than non-human animal suffering. And is it? Because also, I mean, if you really do look at it, the most, discriminated against group on Earth is non-human animals. Probably the group that gets the worst lot out of any creature alive is the chicken. Which have the absolute worst lives of pretty much every factory farm creature. So that is an argument that could be made, and he's just trying to point out that, listen, you have a bias, believing that humans are more important than the rest of us. So start understanding your own bias and look inward and understand that. Now, I'm going to end here just by talking about the book itself that he wrote called Animal Liberation. This book kick-started as I said sort of in the beginning, it sort of kick-started, in a sense, this movement in many ways. It opened a lot of people's eyes to what was happening to non-human animals, because a lot of the stuff is also obfuscated. We are not shown these things, because why would we be shown these things? They don't want us to see these things. They want to keep it from us. But that's obviously wrong. Now, the thing is, it did have a big impact. But Peter Singer has expressed regret about it. And I'm reading this from the Wikipedia page because this is like a profoundly sad thing. He sort of thought it would become, we hoped that it would be a big thing, it would cause a lot of people to be like, we need to care about non-human animals. And when he was asked about the book's impact, he said this: it's had effects around the margins, of course, but they have mostly been minor. When I wrote it, I really thought the book would change the world. I know it sounds a little grand now, but at the time, the 60s still existed for us. It looked as if real changes were possible, and I let myself believe that this would be one of them. All you have to do is walk around the corner to McDonald's to see how successful I have been. So, yeah, I mean, animal liberation influenced a lot of people, but ultimately we still consume the flesh of non-human animals, and we exploit them in experimentation, and things are pretty much just as bad as they've ever been. We, for instance, don't do things like vivisection anymore, but I mean, that's a really low bar, to clear, to be like, oh yeah, we're not going to do vivisection. Cool. So, yeah, this is not a happy little video. There's also animals making noises outside, which is always great to hear. Some. I think they might be Tarantal. I think they are Tarantal. For those who don't know what Tarantal is, it's a guinea fowl. So, yeah, pretty much ending off here. And, yeah, ended on a sad note. But I mean, when we're doing animal studies in general, sad note is the predominant. You don't really get to go, yay, animals. It's a depressing area. And actually, I think this particular anecdote has been criticized a lot, but by like the eco-feminists who I discussed the whole series about ecofeminism. The sort of bunch of previous videos were about that. But there's this anecdote which still sums it up quite perfectly, in that Peter Singer and his wife, when he was still busy like writing the book, also my phone just dinged, and I was sure I put it on silent. Be silent, phone. And I'm leaving this in. So, yes, the anecdote at the end. So in this anecdote, he says that he was with his wife, and it was while he was busy writing the book, and then he got invited to someone's house who heard that he was writing a book about animals, and was so excited. I love animals. And had him over, and she had a bunch of pets. And she was like, oh, I believe you're making a book about animals. So how many pets do you have? And they said, we don't have pets. We don't really particularly like animals necessarily. We believe that they should be treated the same as everyone else, and that they are creatures that have a moral rights the same as we do, and so we should try to protect that. And she didn't really understand that perspective, to be like, oh, but wouldn't you have pets if you like animals? And she says this while preparing ham sandwiches, which the inherent hypocrisy of being like, oh, I love animals, when they're alive and dead. It's sort of, but creepy, but scary. That we don't even realize this. You don't realize that you literally sit there going, I love animals so much, while eating spaghetti bolognese with mince in it. You're sitting there being like, I love animals. I love them so much. And I see myself as a really caring person. I like animals, and I feel really in touch with animals. He says as he eats an egg. You're kind of showing your hand that you haven't realized what you're doing. But this is a bias that many of us have and don't even realize it. That is the way it goes. But anyway, we will be ending off here. If you have enjoyed this, probably enjoyment is not the right word, but if you found this informative, then please do the usual things, like, subscribe, comment, stuff, and check the description for other things I do, because I do a bunch of other nonsense. And I hope that everybody has a great day, week, month ahead, and goodbye.